brainstorming about how you might apply similar actions or activities or methodologies at your own institutions and in your own organizations. And then you'll actually have a chance to develop a research question that you could use to launch yourself into an assessment project plan. So those are kind of our hopes for your takeaways from this, and we will just see how it goes. I'm not making any promises. So just some background on John and I. We come from the subfield of librarianship known as information literacy. So if you're like, these people are being really bossy, or why are they giving me these strict structures and time limits? It's just that that's the teacher within, and we simply cannot ignore it. Before we launch into that active engagement piece, we wanted to give you kind of a little bit of a way of thinking and getting your mind around adopting some of these approaches and strategies for your own self, such that they tie into your own professional identity and match with your own, the priorities of your own institutions. So we'll talk a little bit about the why and the how of assessment before we actually get into that brainstorming and practice part. So I first just wanted to harken back to something that Ashley suggested, which is that assessment it's at its most pure when it comes from a sense of inquiry. When we are curious and asking questions about our own professional practice, this is what inspires people, right? So it's also kind of troublesome because it raises a lot of questions for us, and it kind of puts us in a liminal space where we don't quite always know what to do. And that can be really challenging for librarians because we are very comfortable in our expertise, right? People come to us to ask questions, and we help them seek out those answers. So that can be very troubling sometimes, to put yourself in that space of saying, I don't know. Let's investigate that. So that is something that I feel that if we can become more comfortable with that liminal space, that can be really, really wonderful. And part of that is looking at everything we do and everything that we are through a lens of assessment. And I thought this was like a lens, but then John told me today that it was more like a 007 kind of thing. So anyway, you can just take this image however y'all want to. So I feel that when we look through this lens of assessment, or whatever word is meaningful to you, as Adam suggested, we could define this differently for ourselves. Maybe it's a sense of inquiry for you. Maybe it's research with a lowercase r, whatever it is, that drives you to seek out evidence and base your practice in that, to look toward change. And when I say change, I mean change that goes beyond us, what we do, what we know, but actually change in the people that we're working with, that we're supporting, and that we collaborate with at our institutions. And because most of us are at institutions of higher education, what we'll be talking about today will actually be shifting that focus of assessment over to our students, our researchers, our scholars that we're collaborating with and working with, and what we can do to bring about change in their lives. So as you might imagine, or as you've probably been thinking about in applying some of these approaches to your own work, that this brings up a lot of questions. And I will say that some of the challenges and issues and problems that we face in academic librarianship today, that's really the hard stuff. Assessment that's not the hard thing. Assessment is that toolkit that actually allows us to start to address these questions and problems that we're all facing. And from my experience, I've seen it as the thing that allows us to gain new perspectives on our professional approaches and to kind of get new angles on the questions that we're asking, such that these problems and issues that we're facing become less problematic and more of opportunities to talk about the role of librarians and libraries in academia, and to tell the story of how much value we bring to those settings. So I also just wanted to say that through this evidence and these data that we're collecting as part of assessment processes, these can take us to amazing opportunities on our campuses. So through these actions and these approaches to bringing about change, we have opportunities to collaborate with colleagues that we never would have met before. Through the Assessment and Action Program, I've seen librarians partnering with institutional researchers, faculty, colleagues from all different departments in terms of disability services for students, counseling services, writing centers. So all of those connections that librarians want to be making, assessment is one avenue that we can start to do that. In addition, the opportunity to lead assessment initiatives is a really wonderful opportunity for librarians, and not only in telling the story of what our organizations can do, but in connecting our colleagues across the campus. So because librarians are situated in that interdisciplinary space that Ashley was talking about, we are uniquely situated to do that. And I just wanted to say a little bit about motivation, because there have been times in my professional life when I've been called upon to do assessment for reasons that may not be quite as empowering for me. So when we get that call that says, the accreditors are coming, that's maybe not as motivating. But what we're hoping to do for you today is to present you with a process for planning an assessment project that you can see yourself in, that you can actually find meaning in. And that takes time, but it also takes working through the process. So we'll do that together today. And it's really not easy, but that's why we wanted to kind of launch into it today. And I'll just ask for a minute my colleagues, my fellow presenters, to respond. Do you feel that assessment work is glamorous? No. Do your coworkers love you for being that person that's always like, we should assess things? Not really. So is this something that you really have to work for? Yes. You guys, thanks. Call and response, always a positive experience. Right, I just wanted to say again, this takes perseverance and persistence, and you know, the way that this comes across today, like we're seeing these beautiful studies are so elegantly packaged as peer-reviewed articles, and what we're not seeing is like the work and the rigor and the frustration that went into all that, and that's the good stuff. That's what we really want to work through a little bit together today. So as I mentioned, librarians with the opportunity to do assessment, that we really can capitalize on a lot of different changing roles. And I feel like this is such an exciting time, and it gives us kind of a different angle on the experience of our students, as well as takes us into that place of inciting change on our campuses. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to John to talk a little bit about how we will put some of these theories into practice.
Hey, everybody. So I'm going to get us started thinking about our own research questions. First, we're going to start with kind of what makes a great research question. What are some things to consider when you're going to that point? And what are some methodologies that you can start to consider, and how to use those methodologies together. And then we're going to give you plenty of time, hopefully, to write out kind of or brainstorm some ideas for your research questions, and then get feedback from your fellow attendees and presenters, so that we can kind of look at those more closely together. So starting out, what is your question? And one thing that I learned from an institutional researcher a couple of years ago that I thought was very valuable is that there's pretty much 3 underlying questions that you can use to help you form a really good research question. And the first one is, what do we want to know? So that one's pretty straightforward. Why do we want to know it? It's the second one. And so I think that one's good because it's like, what problem are we actually addressing through this research question? And then what do we think we're going to do with the results when we're finished? And the reason I like that one is because I think it situates that closing of the assessment loop right at the beginning, right at the start of your assessment plan and your process. And that is always everyone's complaint about assessment, is that we do it, but yet we're having a really hard time closing the loop. So putting that in the forefront of your research question is always really, really helpful. I think in any kind of inquiry with your practice. So some criteria for research questions that we'll just go through, and we'll have a chance to check your research questions against some of these criteria. But first, is it measurable? So can we actually find out what we've set out to find? Is it actionable in two ways? So are we able to actually take action and go through an assessment plan as a library or as a department or as an institution? But then also, are we capable of taking action and creating change based on what we find out? Is it related to students or researchers at your institution? So is it centered in those communities that our work helps to support or that we partner with? And is it making a correlation to the impact that we make on those populations? So is it looking for that connection that we've talked about? Maybe it's not direct, maybe it is correlative, but still looking at that. Is it collaborative, as Carrie mentioned? So are we able to burst out of those four walls of the library and look on campus to find partners like teaching faculty, like our assessment office, like the Teaching and Learning Center? And then finally, is it aligned with priorities of the library and the institution at large? So, you could have the most beautiful research project in the world, and you could have the best answers, but if nobody cares about what you have to say and your story, then, so good luck with that. Okay, so those are just some criteria to consider when shaping your research question. Let's look at an example of a research question that's just kind of, So, example, are open educational resources, OERs, better for students than textbooks? So what's the problem with this research question? I can start us off by saying that it's kind of difficult because what we have here is a yes or no question. It doesn't really open us up for inquiry, for looking at how something plays out on a particular population. Also, we'll really have to work hard to define better. So what does better mean? And to pick that apart and unpack that would be a really, really tough task, I think. Also, what we're doing is we're sort of pitting our stuff against stuff, which is always another thing when you're looking at impact that can become complex and difficult. So we're looking at textbooks versus OERs, and are those even comparable in some capacity? So you're going to have a difficult time aligning those two different things. And it also takes us away from that user center. So our researchers or our students, is it really looking at the effect on those things or on those people, those populations? Does anybody have anything else they wanted to add? Yeah, the specificity. How vague are we? Yeah, so and that you can start with a broader question, but you definitely would have to narrow it down and drill down to that population. And the improved example doesn't really address that, but thank you for putting that together. Because it's true, you would actually have to find a specific population. You couldn't just let it be that way. Here's a revised example. What impact does the use of library resources and OERs as primary instructional materials have on student learning? So the improvement upon this one here is that we're looking at, we've moved our population back into the center of this question. We're looking for the impact of this thing that the library does, part of our practice, on this population, and what happens with them as a result of that connection that we make. So we're moving back to impact, and we're moving a little bit away from the sort of back and forth between the different types of stuff that we have. So I think that's why this is a more focused, not as focused as if we were to mention a particular student group, but we could do so. and helps us to really kind of drive home what we want to look at, our work and the impact on our users. So we're going to move a little bit into different types of methodologies, and this is just like not even methodologies 101, this is like methodologies 0.5 because we don't have a ton of time. Everything that I am talking about with methodologies comes from Assessment Clear and Simple. Barbara Walvert is on your reading list, and she is one of those people that if I could invite 3 people to dinner, she would be one of them. She's part of the Emeriti at Notre Dame, and it would be her and Oprah. And then you can just guess who that third person would be. I'll let you sit on that for a while. Yeah, and then you, Carrie, of course, absolutely. Right here. So quantitative measures, which is anything numeric that we can collect, and some of you are already collecting that, to learn about a population. So these are our use statistics, GPA correlative designs. So we looked at some of the RFIDs, locations, surveys, rubrics. So anything that's numeric. And let's talk a little bit about what it's good for and what it may not be so great at. So really great at allowing us to gather information from a relatively large group of participants so we can pull in those numbers. It allows us to compare across groups or individuals and then generalize that to a broader audience. We have this sample size, and based on what we found out about this large sample, we are able to make these inferences about our populations. And it lends to those statistical techniques and allows for determining those relationships and correlations and everybody's favorite S word, significance. So really good at that. What it's not really good at is it can't necessarily tell us the why of our population. Why are they doing this? So why are they behaving in this way in our space with our collections? We don't get that kind of granularity with them, which is where that qualitative information comes in handy. So this is more exploratory research used to gain that understanding and underlying reasons, the opinions, those motivations of our populations. And these are in the form of focus groups. You know, somebody said that they were starting to do focus groups on their campus, those interviews and open-ended questions and surveys. And we got to see that in one of the last studies with the ROI and just using that qualitative data to understand what the return on investment was with the library resources among faculty. So it can give you that kind of granularity, that deeper understanding, that anecdotal information. What is it not so great at? So we can't use it necessarily to generalize to our whole general population. We just lost you, come back, okay. And so there's some difficulty with qualitative in assessing relations between these characteristics. So you're not necessarily be able to make those kind of wide leaps with your populations and look at the greater audience and make decisions because it does go through those individualized filters of people. So I think the moral of the story with these different methodologies is that it's important to use a mix of methodologies. And as Ashley mentioned, many studies have only used one at a time. But what happens is when you use what we call triangulation, which is the use of 2 or more methodologies to answer any research question, is that you start to get a little bit of both. You get to see how that wide population is using or how they're behaving or thinking, but then you get a little bit more of that why with the qualitative data. And that helps to enrich your story and your library's story, I think, dramatically than if you were to just use one methodology. And as I've worked with librarians on assessment and action, I've noticed that they have been able to create more impact and change based on multiple method approach and using that kind of triangulation. So just something to think about with methodologies. Okay, so I'm just going to move on briefly. In your packet, you have a legal size document that displays an example of an assessment plan. So we won't have time to go through every step of this assessment plan. I just wanted to point out one thing that I think is very important. about assessment is that to consider this assessment as a cycle. So there are always going to be those milestones that you reach, and it's rarely linear. It is this iterative and cyclical process, and it is recursive. And sometimes you just gotta get up to get down, right? So you gotta reach a point and realize that we have some issues here with our assessment project. Let's go back to that milestone before and make those tweaks and then move forward again. So there's not a straight line to that finish line, always. But it helps to think of it this way, I think, because it begins with a question and then it ends with action based on that question. So, this cyclical kind of view of assessment, I think, is so helpful for me, and I've seen it with other librarians who have those kind of jitterbugs about getting started with an assessment process. So, all right. Well, now we're going to get to the part where you get to talk to each other, so I'm going to pass it off to Carrie.
Thanks, John. So while you have your packets out, the first activity we're going to do is brainstorming, and as you might imagine, it's going to be quite structured. So we'll be using this handout that looks like a grid, and it's called a charrette handout. This is an activity that I learned about from my friend, Don Draper, and a lot of artistically minded individuals use this to facilitate brainstorming. So to do this next activity, the brainstorming, you'll need 3 things. Something to write with, your charrette handout, and a partner. So go ahead and find a partner, sit by that person. I'll check in with you in a minute.